When the audience stood up, Steve Harvey didn't know what to say. For 35 years he had owned every stage he walked on. Comedy clubs, arenas, television studios. Steve Harvey was the man who always had the perfect comeback, the right joke, the exact words to fill any silence. But on this particular afternoon in the Family Feud studio, something happened that no script could have prepared him for. The cameras kept rolling, the lights stayed bright, but for the first time in his legendary career, Steve Harvey stood frozen in the center of that stage, his mouth open, his eyes glistening, unable to form a single word. What happened in those few seconds would become one of the most powerful moments ever captured on daytime television. But to understand why a man known for his quick wit and commanding presence suddenly found himself speechless, we need to go back to where it all began, to the moment a family walked onto that stage carrying a weight no game show was designed to handle. It was a Tuesday morning when the Rodriguez family arrived at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. From the outside, they looked like any other family excited to be on television. Maria Rodriguez, the team captain, was a 42-year-old elementary school teacher from Phoenix. Her husband Carlos stood beside her, along with their 3 children, Sofia, 18, Miguel, 16, and the youngest, Isabella, who had just turned 12. They wore matching blue shirts and nervous smiles as they waited in the green room, practicing their responses to potential survey questions. But there was something the producers didn't know. Something the other family competing that day didn't know. Something that would transform an ordinary episode into a moment that would circulate across social media for years to come. 6 months earlier, the Rodriguez family had received news that shattered their world. Isabella, their vibrant, softball-playing youngest daughter, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. The treatments had been brutal. The medical bills had piled up so high that Maria had taken a second job, and Carlos had started driving for a rideshare service on weekends. They'd sold their second car. They'd borrowed money from relatives. They'd done everything they could, but the financial pressure was crushing them almost as much as the emotional weight of watching their daughter fight for her life. Steve Harvey stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The decision to audition for Family Feud had come from Isabella herself. During one of her chemotherapy sessions, she'd watched an episode on the hospital television and turned to her mother with that smile, that beautiful, brave smile that somehow still appeared even when she was exhausted and in pain. "Mom," she'd said, "we should go on that show. We could win money to help with the bills. And I want to meet Steve Harvey before." She hadn't finished the sentence. She didn't have to. Maria had applied that same week. The odds of getting selected were astronomically low. Thousands of families applied every year. But somehow, miraculously, 3 months later the call came. They'd been chosen. Isabella's doctors had adjusted her treatment schedule to make sure she could make the trip. The Make-A-Wish Foundation had even helped arrange their flights and hotel. Now they stood backstage, waiting for their turn to compete. Isabella wore a colorful headscarf that Maria had helped her tie that morning. Her face was pale, and she moved slowly, but her eyes were bright with excitement. She clutched a handmade sign that read, "Team Rodriguez fighting for family." Steve Harvey had no idea about any of this when he walked onto that stage to start taping. His routine was the same as always: check the cards, greet the families, launch into his opening jokes. The energy in the studio was electric, as it always was. The audience was warmed up and ready. The lights were perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. "All right, all right, all right." Steve's voice boomed across the studio as he strode to center stage, that signature smile lighting up his face. "We got 2 amazing families here today, ready to play the feud." The audience erupted in applause. Steve pointed to the opposing family, the Johnsons from Ohio, and traded some playful banter with them. Then he turned to the Rodriguez family. "Now let me meet the Rodriguez family from Phoenix, Arizona." Steve walked over to their podium, his hand extended to shake Maria's. "How you doing, Maria?" "We're doing great, Steve. Thank you so much for having us." Maria's voice was steady, but those who knew her well could hear the slight tremor underneath. Steve went down the line, shaking hands, making jokes, doing what he did best, making people feel comfortable, making them laugh. When he got to Isabella, he bent down slightly to meet her eyes. "And what's your name, young lady?" "Isabella." Her voice was soft but clear. "Isabella! That's a beautiful name. You ready to play?" Steve flashed that warm smile that had made him America's favorite host. "Yes, sir." Isabella smiled back, and something in that smile, something Steve couldn't quite name in that moment, struck him. But the show had to move on. There were questions to ask, buzzers to hit, points to score. The first round began. The question appeared on the board. "Name something people do when they're nervous." Maria hit the buzzer first. "Bite their nails." The answer was up there, number 3. The Rodriguez family chose to play. They were off to a good start. As the round progressed, Steve did his usual routine, reacting to answers, making jokes about the survey results, playfully teasing the contestants. The audience laughed at all the right moments. The Johnson family waited patiently for their chance. Everything was going exactly as planned. But then, during a commercial break, something happened that wasn't in any script. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. A production assistant approached Steve during the break. "Steve, we need to let you know something about the Rodriguez family." The PA's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "The youngest daughter, Isabella, she's battling leukemia. The family applied because they're struggling with medical bills. We thought you should know before we continue." Steve's expression changed instantly. The smile faded. His eyes went to Isabella, who was laughing at something her brother was saying, adjusting her headscarf with one thin hand. In that moment, Steve Harvey, the comedian, the entertainer, the man who could joke about anything, felt something shift inside him. He'd been doing this show for years. He'd met thousands of families. He'd heard countless stories. But something about this moment, about this family, about that brave little girl in the colorful headscarf, hit differently. Maybe it was because he was a father himself. Maybe it was because he'd spent his career making people laugh. And here was a family that had been given every reason to stop laughing but still showed up with smiles. Maybe it was simply that sometimes, in the middle of our carefully constructed routines, life presents us with a moment that demands we stop performing and start being human. When the cameras came back on, the audience expected Steve to pick up exactly where he'd left off. Jokes, reactions, the usual rhythm of the show. But Steve Harvey had made a decision. He wasn't going to just host this episode. He was going to do something that protocol said he shouldn't do, something that would throw off the entire production schedule, something that might even get him in trouble with the network. He was going to stop the show. The round continued for a few more minutes. The Rodriguez family was doing well. They'd racked up significant points, and Isabella had even gotten a chance to answer a question. "Name something cold," Steve had asked, and she'd said ice cream, without hesitation. It was on the board. Number 1 answer. The family had erupted in celebration, hugging her, and even the competing Johnson family had applauded. But as they moved into the next round, Steve kept looking at Isabella. At her tired eyes. At the way she held onto the podium for support. At her family surrounding her, their love for her evident in every glance, every touch, every encouraging word. And then Steve Harvey did something that no one in that studio, not the producers in the control room, not the camera operators, not the audience members, not even his own crew who'd worked with him for years, had ever seen him do before. He stopped the game. Right in the middle of a question, Steve put down his card and turned to face the Rodriguez family. The studio fell into confused silence. The music stopped. The audience stirred uncertainly. The producers in the control room leaned forward, wondering if there was a technical problem. "Hold on," Steve said, his voice different now, softer, heavier. "Just hold on a second." Maria's eyes widened. Had they done something wrong? Were they being disqualified? Carlos reached for his daughter's hand. The Johnson family looked at each other, equally confused. Steve walked away from his mark, the spot on the floor where he was supposed to stand, and moved toward the Rodriguez family podium. Every camera operator scrambled to follow him. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't in the rundown. This was pure, unfiltered, unplanned humanity breaking through the carefully orchestrated structure of a television show. "You know what?" Steve said, and his voice cracked slightly. The audience leaned forward. "They told me something during the break. They told me about what your family's going through." Maria's hand went to her mouth. Isabella looked down at her feet. Sophia and Miguel moved closer to their little sister. Steve's eyes were glistening now. "And I gotta tell you something. We do a lot of shows here. We meet a lot of families. We laugh, we play games, we give away prizes. But every once in a while..." He paused, collecting himself. "Every once in a while, you meet people who remind you what courage really looks like." The studio was absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve reached up and took off his suit jacket. The signature Steve Harvey three-piece suit, tailored, perfect, part of his brand, and he took it off right there on camera. He draped it gently over Isabella's thin shoulders. It was enormous on her small frame, but she clutched it like it was made of gold. "This is for you," Steve said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met. And I want you to know that whatever happens with this game, whatever points we score, whatever money is on that board, none of that matters as much as what you've already won." "What's that?" Isabella asked, her voice small. "You've already won the fight that matters most. You've kept your spirit. You've kept your family together. You've kept your smile." Steve bent down so he was at her eye level. "That's the real victory, sweetheart." Tears were streaming down Maria's face now. Carlos had turned away, his shoulders shaking. Sophia and Miguel were holding each other, crying openly. And then something happened that no one had planned, no one had orchestrated, no one had expected. One person in the audience stood up. Then another. Then a whole row. Within seconds, the entire studio audience, every single person, was on their feet, applauding. Not the polite, prompted applause that happens on game shows. Not the enthusiastic cheering that producers encourage. This was different. This was raw, genuine, overwhelming appreciation for a moment of pure human connection. The applause built and built, becoming almost thunderous. People weren't just clapping, they were crying, calling out encouragement, raising their hands in tribute. The Johnson family, the opponents who were supposed to be competing against them, had come around from their podium and were applauding too, some of them in tears. Steve Harvey turned to face the audience, and that's when it happened. That's when America's most confident host, the man with the perfect comeback for every situation, found himself completely and utterly speechless. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked at the standing crowd, at the Rodriguez family behind him, at his jacket on Isabella's shoulders, and he couldn't form words. His hand went to his mouth. His eyes closed. His head dropped. And Steve Harvey, the king of comedy, the master of wit, stood in the center of that stage and wept. The cameras kept rolling. The producers in the control room had stopped giving directions. This was beyond television now. This was beyond entertainment. This was a moment of collective humanity captured on film, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. When Steve finally collected himself enough to speak, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've been doing this a long time," he said, addressing the audience. "And I've never felt anything like this in my life." The applause intensified. People were calling out, "We love you, Steve! God bless that family! You're a good man!" Steve turned back to Isabella and knelt down one more time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "You call me if you ever need anything," he said, pressing it into her small hand. "Anything at all. Your family now." The Rodriguez family won that day, Not just the game, though they did win that too. They won something far more valuable. In his jacket pocket, Isabella later found an envelope. Inside was a check from Steve Harvey's personal account, along with a note in his handwriting. For Isabella's treatment. Keep fighting, warrior. Steve! 3 months later, Isabella's doctors declared her cancer in remission. The jacket still hangs in her room, too precious to ever give back. And Steve Harvey carried that moment with him forever, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop, listen, and let your humanity show. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because this is what happens when compassion meets courage, when a game show becomes a moment of grace, and when one man's decision to break protocol changes lives forever.